Welcome everyone. Thank you guys for joining us today for this exciting session. We have Jonathan with us who's going to be giving us a really great talk today. Just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. For all of you guys who like to use Instagram, Twitter, any other social media, please do tag us tonight. Share your thoughts, your ideas, any screenshots you want to take throughout the session. It's really great to just get the word out there and also get to see what kind of buzz that we can create from tonight's session. Also, we will be recording this session and it will be available after on YouTube, and we can also share it from there as well. I think a lot of you guys who have been with us before probably already know Jonathan, as he's given us a couple talks before, but just to give a quick introduction for anyone who's new, Jonathan is what can I say? There's a lot to say about Jonathan, but firstly, he is the one who actually founded the Human-Centered Design Meetup years ago. I think it was over 5, 6 years ago when he was living here in Dubai. And then when he left to Australia, to go back to Australia, I helped with sort of co-organizing it still with him. So he was still helping us, organize and put together the meetup whilst he was in Australia. And now that he's back here, he's back heading it up again, and I do help out with that as well. But what's really great is that you can see the passion that Jonathan has for teaching, for helping the communities that he lives in, and even the ones when he wasn't living in here in Dubai, to really understand UX, understand product design, and really share the knowledge that he has gained over the past 16 years of design experience that he has. So it's really great to have him here today to talk to us about his experience, to share a little bit about how he looks at design sprints, and yeah, just a lot of wealth of knowledge to take in from Jonathan. So the slide is up here to learn a little bit more about him, and I'm sure if you guys do want to connect with Jonathan afterwards, Jonathan, they can connect with you via LinkedIn. I'm assuming that would probably work well for you.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Let's, without further ado.
Great.
Without further ado, I'll just pass it on to Jonathan and he can share his presentation with us today.
Thanks, Nada. You can see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, yeah, thanks everyone for joining, wherever you are. As Nada said at the beginning, I don't know if everyone caught that, we'd like the meetup to be interactive. So Nada's going to be moderating. I'll try to pause as I go from slide to slide. If you have a question, please jump in and ask through the chat. Nada will be kind of maybe answering some, maybe asking me some. We'll have plenty of time to cover all of that. So you don't have to wait till the very end. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about what is a design sprint. But I think a lot of you can find that out from, just Googling design sprint. It's been around for a little while. There's a book out there. We'll mention that. What I'm really here to talk about, the core thing, is a couple of case studies and the challenge for those particular initiatives and why a design sprint helped to solve that particular challenge. And then what the lessons learned was, as well as how they differed in terms of practicality of actual, methodology of conducting a design sprint, and then kind of conclusions overall and some links. I know we have people from some who have done this before many times, others who maybe never, others who are just curious. So there'll be plenty of resources to share as well. So what's a design sprint? In more traditional way of, product development life cycle of how we build digital products predominantly, but I guess also not necessarily just digital products. We have an idea, we then, design it, build it, launch it, and we learn from once something is in the wild, before we, generate new ideas. The big difference here, and with a design sprint, is that we go from idea to learning and, back to the idea in a much shorter time span, before we then build. So we save a lot of time, resources, money on having validated our ideas. I'll just put sorry, I forgot to put do not disturb on. Before we actually build things, we get them validated. So the definition by Google Ventures, which is where in Google, Jake Knapp, who's written a book on the design sprint, which I'll share with you the link at the end. But if you haven't heard of it, there's a very well-known book which is very practical and outlines how to conduct design sprints. So it's recommended if you haven't done it. Anyway, their definition is a design sprint is a 5-day process for answering critical business questions through design, prototyping, and testing ideas with customers. So one point I want to make, and I'll be making it throughout, is my view of, as Nada said, having done this for a little while, is that yes, the book was written in 2010. Design sprints, some people might brand as something very new or relatively new, but the design process has been around for longer than that. And a lot of the principles have existed for a longer period. The big change here is, to package it up and turn it into a book, and be able to sell that. And I think there's been a lot of success as well as buy-in within organizations in how you do that. But I'll be, one of my philosophies or views or opinions, which I'll be sharing, is that it doesn't have to be 5 days. It doesn't have to be all these activities. There are different iterations of this, but this can be great to solve these big challenges. AJ&Smart a few years ago have turned this into 4 days, which you can also see on their site. But you could also have 10 days. You can have a research sprint. You can have, as we know, dev sprints already exist, but there's other permutations of it. So why a design sprint? It helps us to focus. We have, cross-functional or, team focusing on the same problem and aligning all the knowledge we have in an organization. It's efficient. There's clear time constraints that are made for the team, and they use their time a lot more efficiently, as opposed to saying, we need to, each day in a design sprint could be weeks or months sometimes of, a challenge. And we get to validation quite quickly. So it's a rapid way of creating a prototype and validating, testing that prototype, which you can then further learn, iterate upon. So at the end of 5 days, if you are to follow the 5-day methodology, you would have a prototype that has been tested, validated by customers. So you will create from nothing something, and maybe low fidelity or medium or whatever fidelity you get to prototype that has been tested. So you've got some answers to some of these challenges in a short space of time. That's the something new. So I'm really quickly going to talk about a few things on how to run it, but you'll see in more practical example in the case study. What you need is a big challenge, and this is, generally speaking, right? You could, this could vary depending on what you have at hand, right? A team of 5 to 7 people, someone appointed a facilitator, another person ideally, but sometimes it's the same person, a decider or a decision maker. And again, ideally 5 users to test a prototype, but depending on what you're doing, could be less, could be more. I've just noticed that I'm flying through this and I'm not posing for questions. Nada, how are we with the questions? Do we have any?
No questions yet.
Cool. So the other couple of just tips, things you need are notes and note and vote. So these are some of the techniques used to avoid big discussion. we write ideas or how might we statements as we going throughout, or depending on what we're doing, or if we're sketching or we're prototyping, we'd get people to just create those. And then we would vote on whatever we feel is the best direction forward with stickers. We make a decision and we move on, as opposed to debating, which, you know, can sometimes take a long time. It's, you know, it's often said it's not a democracy. You've got a decision maker there for a reason, and you need to think carefully about who that decision maker should be, as well as the facilitator, right? And it's also time framed, right? So again, to the same point, all activities have a specific time allocated, and you try as best you can to stick to that time. It's quite intensive. If you are to do this in a whole week with, you know, that cross-functional team, or, you know, 5 to 7 people in a room, it's quite an intensive week, right? So sometimes you do have gaps, or, you know, it can span more than those 5 days. Or less, right? Could be a workshop. Some of the common challenges are organizational, as you know, politics, getting the right people to solve the challenge, buy-in from the company that this is methodology that we should use, and a way to make decisions, alignment by cross-functional teams with the problem that we're solving, priorities, etc., expectations of what comes out of it, and again, aligning, you know, those expectations, as well as what to do next. Like, we might have a part of a solution, or we might have a solution, and should there be further validation? Do we just go on to build it? Those are some common challenges. How are we going with questions? Anything?
Yeah, we have one question that says, any advice on how to select the best decision maker?
Yeah, great question. So you want someone that's impartial, right? One of the challenges we have right now, and we're not about to conduct a design sprint, we're about to conduct a research study looking at workflows of a product, is we're doing a listening tour, which is just internal research before we talk to customers, speaking to internal stakeholders. And we're finding there's a lot of bias. So often it's the designer who is hopefully the impartial one, who's just there to seek the truth. And when you appoint a decision maker, it's important that that decision maker doesn't bring in too much bias towards a solution they've already got in mind, or a certain department that they align with in the business, or they're, you know, too focused on the tech, or too focused on the design, or too focused on marketing. Ideally, they would be neutral, but also ideally they would have power. They would be able to be, you know, respected within the business or within the startup or whoever you are, to just say, okay, yep, move on. But you also, at the same time, you don't want the founder or the highest paid person in the room to be that decision maker, because bias obviously gets created there too. So it's someone that I guess, yeah, is as neutral as can be. But like I said, sometimes if you don't have enough people, as I'll show you in some of my examples, the facilitator and the decision maker can be the same person. Not necessarily ideal, because you do want each to focus on their part and wear that hat, but it can happen. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a few more questions here. So one question is, what does one need to prep for before going into a design thinking workshop?
Great. I'll answer that shortly. Next.
Okay.
Sorry.
And then the next one is, how do you get people that don't understand this process to clear out their schedule for 1 week, especially people with big job positions? For me, this works best in startups and is harder in big organizations, which is very true, yeah.
Great question. The other one was also great, but I'll cover it shortly. So like I said, often in big organizations, it's not 5 days back to back. Even in the examples I'll show you, none of those are 5 days back to back. It really depends on what you're working with. I'll speak about each example I show, but you could look at who are the people that need to be in the room, and think of it as opposed to a day as a workshop, a 2 or 3 hour workshop. And what are the activities that you need to conduct? You could have a whole day, say that there is maybe one day that you say to people, look, I need you for a whole day, but the other pieces are workshops, and you could space it over, say, 2 weeks, for example. Ideally, it is quite concise because you want to get through, the activities, which I'll show in a second. I didn't want to put too much in the introduction, but I think it's maybe a bigger question around design maturity and people understanding and buying into design and design thinking, design practice as a methodology. But maybe I'll cover it in a bit more detail shortly. Anything else before we keep going?
Yeah, you did mention, someone is saying that you said it's not a democracy for the note and vote portion of brainstorming. Please clarify, if decision maker or decision maker has the power to lead the decisions, then why note and vote?
So, yeah, the decision maker is there, I guess, to settle any debates. If you have votes, then the votes should speak for themselves. But sometimes we will get to a situation where we could have, we haven't narrowed it down to one thing. There could be 2 ideas that people love, and we're debating those things. The point I was making is that it's not about pleasing everyone or some of the challenges that exist in business. It's about trying to go past that and get to a solution, or even multiple solutions, right? There could be a decision to say, look, both of these things are valid. Let's create 2 prototypes and let's test both things. And maybe we should push the sprint out by an extra few days so we can do A/B testing, for example. But I guess that's why I meant it's not a democracy, in that not everyone has an equal vote. And if we want to avoid continuous debate. Does that make sense, Nada?
Yeah, definitely. And there's just one more, which I think, again, this is all around the same topic, is that how do you get buy-in from business stakeholders who have little exposure to the design process or any sprints on that matter, and introduce them to this concept of design sprints? Any tips that you can give on maybe your experience?
Again, another great question. It's something I think all designers battle with, regardless how mature your organization is in terms of design awareness. I think I would probably start small, not necessarily start with 5 days. I think one thing I wanted to share as well in this presentation, and it's not in a slide, so I'm glad this question was asked, is you can do something similar to a design sprint in one workshop and go from, an idea to a very, low fidelity kind of prototype, not necessarily test it, but in an ideation workshop where you gather ideas. And I think it's starting small. So it's getting buy-in or convincing people, or saying, look, just try this thing. Let's do a workshop. Let me run it. I'll share this workshop later. It's all up on the web. It was in 2014 at UX Lisbon by a lady named Kate Rudder. It's called Lean UX workshop. And if you get buy-in for that one workshop and you're able to facilitate it and people can see the value, that's, you've made some impact. Then you can grow that and go from one workshop to maybe let's do a day, or let's do a couple of days over span of time. And eventually it's a week. I mean, and the other thing is, obviously books are great, right? Or even chapters of books, or if you can give a talk, do a lunch and learn. It's a big question. I could do a whole meetup on that one. How do you, impact businesses? What are your thoughts on that one, Nada? How would you answer it?
So one of the things that I've kind of used with my team is that I let them realize what is the deliverable that's going to come out of this sprint. So if it's going to be like a flow fidelity prototype, or even let's say we're going to use the sprint to finalize a specific journey in our app, and this sprint will be focused on that. If those business leaders want to be part of that, which usually they'll have an opinion, they'll want to feel like they're part of it, that might actually try to convince them to take the time to join that sprint and and understand, like to understand what is going to be the outcome of it. So if you can sort of, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the sprint, in a workshop of a sprint, and lots of stuff is going on, but maybe if you hone in on like the deliverable or what's going to be the outcome of it, and then they feel like, oh, I want to be part of that because I have an opinion, I have something to say, it has to support a business objective as well, that can maybe convince them to want to join and experience it. And I think once they start to experience it and they can see, you know, the outcomes of it, they might in the future want to be more and more part of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's just selling the ROI, right? And maybe it's juxtaposing that with, if we were to do it the way we're currently doing it, it's going to cost us this much time, this many people, and potentially it will create this amount of waste. If let's try this, and you know, if you could put a dollar value to it, you can put a time value to it, and you can articulate those benefits, or even do like a one pager, you know, to project on a page kind of a thing to, again, sell those benefits. But yeah, great point, Nada. Any other ones before we keep going?
Nope, that's all for now.
Cool. So yeah, like I said, I'll be talking about two very different case studies, which I facilitated last year. So it's not that long ago. I worked for Isobar. Isobar, for those of you who don't know, they're not that big in Dubai. They are in Dubai, but they don't do human-centered design. They do, I think, predominantly marketing and digital marketing. But in the UK, Australia, and the US, they're fairly well known in terms of, you know, human-centered design, org transformation, service design, a whole bunch of stuff. And for each of these, and Functionly is a startup that I am an advisor on, and I used to work around 15 hours a week last year before I came to Dubai, just as a secondary kind of a, you know, job. For both of them, I'll talk about the challenge and why, you know, why we chose the design sprint, the sprint itself, which I didn't want to get into in the beginning because I'll get into that detail now, and it's in what we did, and you'll see the difference between the two, the results that came out, the lessons learned, as well as the conclusion. And I think the really interesting part, which I'd like to, hopefully there'll be lots of questions, and is the lessons, right? Because the what we did, I think, again, a lot of you can look up online quite easily. It might be interesting to see, you know, what the differences were, but I don't want to kind of go into a huge amount of detail because that stuff's in the book, but it's more around what we did, and sorry, not what we did, what we learned, and potentially how we do it differently next time. So first I'll talk about Isobar, which is an agency in Perth. While I was there in Western Australia, it was quite a small team. There was only 11 of us. In Melbourne and Sydney, much larger. So, you know, around maybe 300 people, but quite a nimble team. And for this sprint, there was only 2 of us in terms of the design component. The development component obviously had other people, but for what I'll share, there were 2 people. And we worked on a startup, which in quite a niche field. I'll try to kind of very quickly describe it, but it's very technical and it's not what we're here to talk about. And the startup's name, which was part of the sprint, we had to come up with a name, was Agero. So the challenge with this first case study, initially this company was an idea. They had a Excel spreadsheet as a prototype, just to kind of sell the concept. And the name of the business was Offshore Decommissioning Consultants, which is quite a mouthful, as you can see. And it was changed. Part of what we did was to Agero, which I forget what it means in Latin, but you can look it up. So ODC are experts in performing comparative assessments, analyzing the effects of offshore decommissioning. So we're basically talking about oil rigs or any other offshore assets, and looking at how you decommission. So these things stay in the ground, these oil rigs, for maybe 30 years or 40 years, but then their life comes to an end, and you need to look at a process of decommissioning it, which involves a lot of consultants, takes a long time. And the opportunity was to use a digital product to simplify that process. So it's going through, you know, stages of looking at safety, environment, economic, societal, other impacts. In other words, some really complex engineering. So a really complex problem that by no means designers or developers, you know, have expertise in. And we had a very short space of time to create, due to budget constraints, a digital product. The current experience was done by consultants and could take months to complete. We had very tight time frame. They came to us in late November 2018, and we had to launch at the oil and gas conference, not earlier this month, because that's the last time I presented this, typo there, sorry. But last year in, I think it was around March, it was March last year, 2019. We only had the budget for one design sprint, and there were 3 development sprints, but that design sprint spanned, I'll show you, over a couple of weeks. Access to the target audience for research, so to test the prototype, was really, really challenging because this is a very niche thing done by very large organizations where you didn't quite have access to the customer, and the customer didn't exist yet in the ideal future, so another challenge. And they had no name, no brand, no identity, no colors, not necessarily requirements or a design brief to create that. And we were required as part of this, which is not traditionally part of a design sprint, to create a brand, a direction, an identity for both the product as well as to be adapted by the organization more broadly. So that's kind of painting the picture, setting the scene. Any questions? Or can I keep going?
Keep going.
Cool. So what we did was, and I just want to stress out, this is not in 1 week. This was over 2 weeks. And as I said, time was very limited, but it's 5 days over 2 weeks. We did have a founder who was available for all of the time, but his other co-founders, there's only 4 of them in the team, were not. And we were also limited in that we couldn't have as many people from the agency as we wanted because budget was limited. So people kind of came in and out of sessions depending on their expertise. So there could be, you know, technical expertise, etc. And yeah, I think that's probably enough. So day one was looking at the vision for the project. So it's very much us doing a lot of listening, understanding and helping them to shape, because they hadn't necessarily done a lot of these activities as a startup, the business goals, creating how might we's throughout the day on Post-it notes, understanding the current journey. So that's one thing I just want to highlight. Again, I don't know if it's typically in a design sprint, but no matter what you do, even if it's something brand new or a startup that doesn't exist, nothing's new under the sun. How are people solving the problem today? Really important that you set the scene from the beginning as to what is that current journey, even if it's done by consultants, etc. And where are you going to hone in? What is the thin slice? What are you going to try to solve? And we also deep dive into their prototype to understand this kind of a proof of concept Excel spreadsheet, what they did. Because I joke with the founder every time I see him. In the beginning, he told us, I just need 4 screens. But again, he's an engineer, right? Design's not his forte. So we ended up with much more than that, of course. And we also created some proto personas. So proto, as most of you know, are just prototype personas, just to understand quickly who are the customers, how are they different, who would be the primary users, who are the decision makers, etc. And at the end of the day, what we got to was an elevator pitch. So it was quite clear and defined what we are, you know, what we're trying to do, who are we trying to sell this to, and how as well. So that was day one, very intense in a workshop. Then there was some time I'm going to talk about it in more detail. I'm probably going into too much detail because it'll be covered shortly in the other slides. We looked at success metrics for the product, how it will be measured, as well as storyboarding, going into more detail from the current journey to the ideal journey and storyboarding. The next day we had ideation, some sketching. We also did something, again, like I said, not typically part of a design sprint, some workshops around brand, where we came with some ideas and we had some voting on identity, colors, fonts, imagery. Day 4 was looking at low fidelity prototype creation, and as well as creating the interview guide of what we will test. And then in a very intensive day, usability testing, analyzing. And it actually wasn't in the same day, but a session later was MVP prioritization and creating the backlog of, okay, what will we build, what will we not build? Any questions? I know I was supposed to kind of highlight it, but went into too much detail. Can I keep going?
Yep, keep going.
Cool. So more detail now, day 1. Throughout the day, and this is something you'll see from Google, from some of the resources I'll share, participants would create how might we statements. Once these opportunities or challenges come up, we also created quite a detailed current journey to look at what is happening, where is the pain, really understand the problem we're trying to solve. This was really great to deep dive into the problem, especially in this example, as it's quite complex, as well as create some, understand who are the users and how do their journeys differ or, intertwine. And then, as I said, that elevator pitch. So for such and such who do, whatever they do, what are we going to do, and how are we, how are we going to deliver on that promise? We then looked at some metrics, and this is something from this workshop I've mentioned, that Lean UX workshop, is making sure we have not just vanity or unhelpful metrics, but really awesome metrics to say what does success look like. A great metric makes you look at all the other ones and say none of these matters. As I said, this is from Kate Rudder's workshop. So something awesome would be percentage of users who share a task. This is an example, not necessarily for this, 3 or more times per day, per week. Something that we can measure, something that we can, try to achieve. And this is obviously just an example, but how are we going to measure the, the success of this product? And besides that, we looked at, it was the start of looking at, this storyboard, and it took many iterations. I mean, this could be, could be a whole day, right? To just look at the process and where does the product sit within that process? Because the story could encompass a bigger, part of the journey. And, it requires scratching things and start looking and shaping what, some screens could look like and have an idea of what you're looking at. And then we get into more detail, right? So from that storyboard, we can start sketching, prototyping, looking at, okay, we're going to need a login screen. We're going to need to make some selections, there's some criteria, scenarios, whatever the interaction looks like. It's getting into a lot more detail. And the other thing, as I said, which is not typically part of a design sprint, but can be done, is we obviously did our homework prior. And it was just myself for this day, and visual designer. And it's dot voting, or like the activity we ran was, green and red Post-its. What do you like? What do you dislike? And why? By the various stakeholders. And we spoke to it, and we voted, and we honed in on, all of those typical brand and visual identity components to help us to, have more of a narrowed down brief, because it was hard for them to articulate what they wanted. Design was new. And then because, as I said, this was doing it as an agency, we had a pretty good idea what we were after, and we did a lot of this work ourselves. I do need to say, though, that the founder, we had a lot of access to him, which was really great. So he would work from our office, the agency's office, and we had as much access to him as we needed, which I'll talk about later as a great benefit. But this is a part, if you're doing the 5 days, say in more of a corporate environment, where you would have people in a room prototyping, maybe on paper or sketching, and you could be voting. And we didn't do that because we didn't have the time or the budget, and we had a pretty good idea. So we created a low fidelity prototype, clickable prototype, that we then went on to test without involvement of the founder. We did have feedback from him and the other co-founders. And then in that last day, like I said, a very intense day, and interesting because I've done a lot of usability testing in the past over longer periods of time than a day. We tested with only 3 customers. And then at the end of the day, it was very lean analysis. So we used a lean usability testing method, which is you take the notes on like an A3 sheet on the fly, as you have a note taker in another room who takes notes. Here's the dashboard, for example. What's your general impression? What do you like? What do you dislike? How would you rate it? And then we can very quickly analyze. And in this day, we didn't even, it was a very intense session just in InVision, adding commentary. This was the analysis. There was no report. There was no mega synthesis. It was just in InVision, everyone in a room at the end of the day, the people that observed the sessions, myself and the other designer, just adding notes to what needed to change in our low fidelity prototype. So,
and Jonathan, there's one question about the users. How did you recruit users for testing?
Yeah, so like I said, it was the contacts of the founder. This was really, really challenging, and we didn't feel comfortable. Like throughout this engagement, I said to the founders from the very beginning, there's a huge risk here because there's been no research from a design perspective, from a human standard design qualitative perspective. There's been no research. His response to that, because he's never done design before, was, I've been doing research for 20 years. This is my life's passion. Like this is, obviously that's a different kind of research. There's a lot of bias to it. And this was a known risk, which I had flagged. And it was only at the end of this whole initiative that he could see, what we meant. The people that we recruited were not, only 1 out of the 3, I would say, was the exact customer, which is a huge risk, right? To have 1 data point. The other 2, one was in the industry and in the area, but probably wouldn't be in the user. And we had 1 no-show. So we used one of the people in the startups who wasn't involved in any of the process and hadn't seen the screens. So we did get some interesting usability feedback, but going to the critical question we were asking was not only is this thing usable, is thinking of your needs to solve this problem, which is a new way of solving it. Does this solution meet the need? And would this thing work? So we had some feedback on that, but I wouldn't say, from like an independent research perspective, we answered it. So I think recruitment is probably, again, that could be a meetup in and of itself. But you typically want to get the people who would use your software. So you don't just want to go to a coffee shop and talk to anyone and do guerrilla research, unless you're testing coffee shops and how people order in coffee shops. Then yes, coffee shops are great. But people often say, hey, just go to a coffee shop, you can ask anyone. My view is you're not going to get great feedback because they may not be your right customers. There's lots of ways of doing recruitment, right? There's social media, etc. But you really want to find the customers who use your software. You can go to agencies to recruitment. There's software online that helps you to find them. You can screen them yourself. But in this example, we were reliant very much, because it's a niche thing, on the founder and his contacts. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on that. I think recruitment is one of the things that's always quite difficult, especially in our region here. I personally don't even know of one recruitment agency that works specifically to recruit for UX and usability testing. So you have a lot of market research companies, but nothing specific to recruitment. So a lot of the time, and in my experience, whenever we're trying to recruit users for any sort of testing or usability testing, it's someone who knows someone who knows someone, that they might fit to the persona of the users that you're trying to design for. But yeah, maybe that's something that we should one day do a test, a meetup on, to see what others are doing and think about that. There's another question that's asking about how you developed your personas. Were the personas created from your own team's ideas of who'd be using the product, or did you actually be able to go out and research and ask questions from users in order to build the personas? Can you speak more to this?
Sure. Again, that's a meetup in and of itself, and Nada is our expert on personas. My personal view, which I'm glad you asked, I'm not going to rant on it too long, I promise, is that designers, especially I think people new to design, try to just tick the boxes of design, and some of those boxes in the past have been personas, journeys, usability testing, those three things. My view is that real value is created when you improve somebody's life. So you need to do as much as you need to, if you believe in lean methodologies and lean UX, to get onto the next stage of the process. Having said that, by researching personas and creating personas, in my experience, having done that at the start of my career many years ago, there's a little return investment of doing all this research on personas. The value of personas is for people to understand you are not the customer. These are the people we're trying to serve, and what are these people's pain points, and let's make sure we're looking at the product from their lens. That's why I love proto personas, and the value they create and play, and they did in this example, was, just going back to that, for us to look at this problem from multiple lenses. So here, for example, we wanted to understand the decision maker, so the CFO, the finance manager. What are their behaviors? What are their goals? What are their needs? And we wanted to understand that actual user, the decommissioning manager, who will use the software. But it was important, especially for a startup or for any business, to distinguish between the two, because the decision maker is the person you need to convince to buy your software, and they're not necessarily using it. It's a challenge we have today here, with more complex software. So it's important to understand the two, but to go out and do a whole heap of research to validate these people, personally, I believe in something more modern, is the Jobs to be Done methodology. It's a great book, just came out, on Jobs to be Done playbook by Jim Kalbach. Happy to share the link. Looking at what are the jobs to be done, and how are we, solving that problem. So to summarize, I know it's a long answer. We looked at this from the lens of who are we trying to create this problem for, and we were far more interested in putting the solution in their hands and understanding, can they solve this problem with the solution, and what are the gaps to solve this problem, and how can we further develop the product. We can still, at the same time as we do that, we can ask these behavioral or these persona questions. But yeah, in my experience, creating these nice artifacts and showing them around the business they're not often understood, and people, misuse them, especially, some friends in marketing. Did you want to, I'm sure you have a comment on this, Nada. What's your view on it?
I mean, like you said, this is really something that we can get into and be quite a long sort of conversation. It really just depends on your objective of what you're going to be using the personas for. And then once you understand what your objective is, you can then know how much effort and time you want to put into those personas to get the return on investment for it. So if, for example, you're entering a new market where you really don't know what the needs are, the opportunities are for users, there's a lot of different ambiguity around it, a lot of different people, different opinions, and perhaps it does make sense to take more time into talking to people, interviewing people, really getting it right. But if you're kind of doing it to help sort of, just push, if you're doing, especially if you're in a lean sort of environment where you don't have that much time, you don't have budgets, you just need to have personas out there that can help you sort of solve and answer some questions and move things along, then I definitely agree with that approach as well, of what you said. So again, I think at the end of the day, it really depends on the objective of the project that you're working on. But we do have another question that's asking about SUS. So the system usability skills. What do you think about using that instead of lean usability testing? Do you think that that could be something that could be looking into, that we could look into?
Yeah, so I don't know if people have heard of lean usability testing. It's basically usability testing, right? It's not that different. It's lean in that we don't, in this example, create great big reports. And it's lean in that we look at taking notes on the fly and analyzing quickly. The system usability score, again, it's something that has been around for a long time, and it really depends what you're trying to measure, whether you would use it or not. Some of the questions in it, I think some people would argue are maybe not necessarily relevant, but you could, I mean, it's always good to have more research, right? It's always good to have perhaps like a survey at the end of your, of your usability tests to kind of look at other potentially quant side. I mean, even though you got small sample, but yeah, I think it'd be great to hear. We've got a very experienced researcher on the call. Maybe you can write your thoughts in the chat. But yeah, I mean, look, personally, again, I just want to stress out, time was very finite in this example. Not only due to budget, but due to having to deliver something. We had to develop the thing and bring it to life, and have something ready for launch. So yes, this particular startup hadn't gone through this process in the most ideal way, but this made sense, and yeah, we definitely we learned enough to go on to the next step. So yeah. Anything you wanted to add, Nada?
Nope, that's all.
Any other questions?
I think that's about it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. The only other point I wanted to kind of make is, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the overarching thing, and I think that's one thing I want people to take away from this talk. If you remember, one thing is the typical answer in design is it depends. You need to, there's no magic silver bullet in design. You can't read any book and say, if I follow this formula, I'll have an answer. It's your job as a designer, or even as someone interested in design or involved as a stakeholder, to help to pick the right methodology to solve the right problem. And a design sprint, while people love it and get carried away from it, doesn't solve everything. And it really depends what you're trying to solve, how big the challenge is, what your constraints are. But again, I'd encourage you to try it and to see, look, there can be lessons, like perhaps it didn't work, or there were challenges. So the next thing we did, which if we're talking about product development, really important. Again, this is not necessarily typically part of a design sprint, is just assessing from the prototype and all the feedback we got and the changes we made to that prototype after the testing, what does the MVP look like? And we were very much limited by the 3 delivery sprints. So this is bi-weekly or fortnightly or 2 weeks. I know they don't use fortnightly in some of the US. 2 weeks sprint. So we had 6 weeks basically to develop this thing. And that's where we had in the room myself. I took the photo, founder, front end, back end, and like a project manager / scrum master, looking at, is that you, Nada? Is everyone on mute? Or?
I think one person isn't. Let me mute them. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. I don't know, Deliveroo's at the door or something. So we had here must have, should have, could have. And then we looked at grouping and theming, log in our various screens. So we could, we wanted, like a typical thing in development, let's solve the biggest problem first that we think could pose risk, because we were quite, it was quite strict. So this is really important, right? But again, not typically part of a design sprint, but I just thought it important to mention, how do you go from a design sprint to then the delivery sprint? You need to carve it up. But again, this is probably a whole meetup in and of itself. Any questions on that before I kind of go on to results?
Nope.
Cool. So I did want to share some of the artifacts. None of this is my work. I worked with a guy who's very talented, visual designer, kind of moving into being more of a product designer, involved in usability testing as well. I tried to bring him to Dubai. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at convincing as well as I thought I am. But some of the inspiration, just to share, and he can talk to this far better than I can, he's a visual designer, is the underwater world of these environments. And what happens when these structures stay in the ground for so long is that they become habitats and ecosystems of themselves. And often the better solution than ripping them up and destroying the life underwater is to leave them, or to, just remove what's above the ground and keep what's underground. And some of the, the blues and some of those colors were the inspiration for the design. So, the aqua, the blue, the navy, and the logo, again, is kind of that industrial, you've got the A and the J, and you've got the above ground, below ground. The founders loved it, and the startup kind of, core team, and they interpreted it far more than his actual vision, which is a great result when it goes beyond whatever you thought of it, when people interpreted the way they did. So yeah, just wanted to share in again, very short time. And it was this sprint and the co-design of getting buy-in and getting thoughts from all of the, the founders of this small startup that were able to, achieve that result, as well as, some of that, the messaging, we helped with collateral as well. And just to show, again, like some of that final product, again, this is by no means I'm trying to show that it's perfect and beautiful, but we were able to get to, something that definitely worked, that solved the problem that, whoa, I don't know what that was, sorry. I think someone's trying to call this room. That was strange, sorry. In quite a short amount of time. Any questions before I get to lessons?
No questions.
Cool. So the lessons and a bit of reflection was upfront quantitative and qualitative research is crucial to minimize the risk and establish product market fit. To your point, Nada, none of this was done. If you don't have a user researcher or user research or a strong understanding of your customer base, you can consider running a research sprint or conducting a research study before you do a design sprint. So research sprints are things that exist out there. It's a way of bundling research in a more of a finite space of time where, you could have experts. You can also have a design sprint that spans, say, 10 days. And then on day 2 and 3, you could have expert interviews People come into the room and you interview them. You don't necessarily need everybody in the room, but whatever. There's different ways of doing that. But again, if you have some of that up front, that can minimize some of the risks, some of the challenges. Recruitment time and access to the right customers for testing should be done up front. This was flagged, but this was a continuous challenge. This was a known challenge, as I said, but wasn't really solved. And it was, yeah, a little bit of lastminute.com, but as I said, access to the right customers was challenging. Building the right design sprint team. We only had one subject matter expert in the sprint and limited availability and expertise from other members of the startup. They jumped in and out, but predominantly it was one voice, one view, which is very risky, right? We don't have enough people to counter or multiple viewpoints. It was also an advantage from our sense as an agency working on this, because we could go a lot quicker and a lot faster. There's less debate, there's less dot voting. We've got this one expert and we know what we want to achieve and we can go through the tasks. But I would not recommend it, right? Ideally, debate is good because we challenge the thinking and we get to a better point. You don't need to design high fidelity screens. A great multidisciplinary team with designers and front-end developers will work together to bring the vision to life. I mean, this was beautiful for me to see because I was reasonably new to this agency. I think I was only there for like about 6 months or less. And we typically worked on very big projects that took much longer and, just took longer. And it wasn't as, I think this was the first design sprint we did out of Perth. And just seeing how much the visual designer needed to do before the front-end developer did was really great for me to see. I'd never seen that done so well. If we've got clarity around our identity in terms of the visual identity and we've got a low fidelity prototype, the designer doesn't need to do high fidelity mocks. They can, work on the bits that need work, but if they sit next to and pair with the front-end developer, it's really great to see that to life. And as a team, if we are very closely working and we're dedicated to this, we can get quick feedback and iterate quickly and get to that final solution and not do the typical kind of waterfall of you need to get to 100% design before we can hand over and etc. Obviously, there's challenges with that. Again, probably for another meetup, but it was great in this example. We were able to work faster. And yeah, I've already stated, design and front-end developer run in parallel, allowing for reduced delivery time as they allowed iterative UI improvements. The other point is collaboration and co-creation with the client is key. The client had access to a hot desk in our office, was always available for reviews, discussions whenever we needed them. Like that's important if you're an agency trying to run this. Access to the project team allowed clients to be part of the process, encouraging an immediate feedback cycle, again, which was great. This surfaced project issues early, allowing for minimal roadblocks, little time wastage. The result was high client satisfaction with project delivered for their launch event. So, you can get that buy-in. So I think just to flip it, if you're doing it for an organization, one of the challenges in any corporate, any organization, to the person who asked about how we get buy-in is involvement. Often as designers, we involve people in the beginning, but sometimes we're busy going on to the next steps of the design process and we forget to include them to have transparency. It's important to have that buy-in throughout, so the next time they see the value, they see the return on investment, and they can give you feedback and critique throughout. That's a healthy thing, right? Any questions on the lessons reflection?
Nothing's come through, no?
Okay, cool. So the next example is on Functionly. And I wanted to just set the scene. Very, very different example. It's me as a part-time employee / advisor So wearing two hats, but yeah, having 15 hours a week, but very much feeling like part of the team. A lot of the employees were part-time. Before I talk about what Functionly is, sorry, I just wanted to show a very quick 2-minute video. But unfortunately, oh, here we go. Hopefully this will work. You can see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Organization charts don't give modern leaders flexibility to navigate uncertain times. But designing an org chart that works for you and your changing business needs is easy with Functionly. Align your leadership team on key accountabilities and strategic initiatives. Find and fill gaps while removing conflicts and duplication in your business, and collaborate on future scenarios. Simply drag and drop your people, accountabilities, and strategic initiatives into place to match your company structure and operating level, and create new levels of clarity, accountability, and certainty for your organization. Design and resource teams better. In your team area, leaders can use employees' reported motivation and expertise to guide responsibility allocation and create a more satisfying role for each person while providing actionable clarity. It's easy to identify resourcing gaps.
I think you get the gist of it. It's only 2 minutes, but I'll stop at 1 minute.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just thought a video, might be better to kind of explain what it is, because it is a complex thing. So it's helping fast-growing companies align their people. When a company grows beyond 25 or even 20 staff, leaders lose visibility of what people are doing, and people aren't aligned. It's a difficult challenge. People understand the problem, but it's really hard to articulate the problem, or even harder to picture a solution for this particular problem. So it's moved on, since these days. But when successful companies grow fast, they break, resulting in misalignment, stress, chaos, wastage. So this startup worked together and started 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and launched last year in February at a conference called SaaStr. So what was the challenge? I just wanted to kind of set the scene of what this thing's about. There was a good amount of discovery research done, which I had done with one of the co-founders by going into past clients who had just seen the consultative model without a product, so just spreadsheets and meeting with people to understand establish their process and understand product market fit in terms of how would you turn this consulting model into a product. So in actual fact, not too dissimilar from the first case study, right? You got a very complex thing, and the current state is consultants doing stuff with spreadsheets, and people want to turn it into a product. But before we did our first design sprint, the CTO, one developer, had done pretty much 100% of design and development. And the team was heavily focused on building a consulting service, sales and marketing. So the aim of introducing design sprints was refocusing people's effort to build a better product. So we've got a bigger virtual product team, and to champion the fact that we're a product company, not a consulting company, and shifts people's mindsets, to promote organization-wide culture of design. So half the team was in the US doing a lot, still consulting, even with the early version of the product. And their idea of a better outcome was better consulting. One of the goals of introducing design sprint was for everyone to understand we're a product company and we want everyone's view, right? You don't have to be a designer to participate in design sprints. And they were close to the customers. So being in Australia, we were far, majority of the customers were in the US, some in Australia, but majority in the US. And kind of bridging these two different viewpoints. The other big challenge was the team was across many time zones, and as those of you who work, with remote teams or even have whatever family in these other places know, it's quite challenging to find the right time. So what we had done was have 2 sprint cycles of 1 sprint US and UK and another sprint Australia and UK, but kind of share. The other big challenge was the USA design sprint, or the US team was, as I said, all implementation people, so they understood the customer viewpoint very well, but it failed when it falls apart when it comes to designing a product, as they weren't experienced in designers or researchers, and wanted to make something quite complex and turn into, my example here of, the Homer Simpson car, of if we just listen to every, feature factory of everything the company customers want, we wouldn't necessarily have a usable thing. We'd have, a very expensive, complex Frankenstein. It's one way of putting it. On the other side, the Australian team had non-implementation people, had marketing, engineering, product design. So there was poor understanding of the customer, but a better understanding of product. So sketches, prototypes took a lot longer to converge on things that solved a real customer problem, because people were trying to imagine the problem for themselves and hadn't seen it firsthand. One thing, just to answer a question that was asked at the beginning, was what do you do before a sprint? And what you can see on the right here, this rectangle, is just zooming in on what's at the bottom. So it's great, and this is great also. It's something we've recently done. One of my colleagues doing a workshop, not a full 5-day sprint, but doing an ideation workshop or a research analysis workshop, where we get, instead of people coming into a workshop, as you know, or any meeting and going, what are we here to talk about? You ask them to do some homework. So pre-sprint, download Miro real-time board, or Mural, if that's what you're using, whatever software you fancy. If you're doing this online, as we are, most of us are these days, maybe some inspiration, some prior research, or some ideas on how other people are solving it. Research potentially that we've got to date, or anything else. And like this could be different points, as well as you kind of, breaking the ice a bit, saying hello and showing what, that you've kind of looked at these things, you've done your homework. So drawing maybe a picture of what you see out the window, adding your profile. What are your top takeaways from the research material? What questions do you still have? What's an example of a product that re-engaged you? Or what's an example of this problem that we're trying to solve, of where you've seen it done well elsewhere? Just, again, these could be different questions. It doesn't have to, you don't have to stick to this. You could also, just to set the scene, pose the challenge of what we're trying to solve in the sprint. How might we, whatever that might be, what are we trying to hone in on? At least your hypothesis of what that is. That could change, right? Maybe after day one, as well as who is the, what are the personas or audiences that we're trying to look at. If you've got more data on those, you can add that. It's up to you. Any question on that?
No question. I think we had a question though. It might have been referring to the past example, but it's typically, what was the time in terms of man hours that would be required to conduct the entire exercise? I guess this is referring to the 5-day sprint. Would the answer be 5 days worth of man hours?
Look, it's kind of like we've been saying throughout. The answer is it depends. Depends the organization you're in, the people who, do they understand the value of this? Are they bought into this? And my advice, as I said from the beginning, is not necessarily if you can lock everybody in a room for a week and do 5 days. That's not what my advice here. My advice is you need to look at, as Nada said with personas, the problem you're trying to solve and what's required. And also, if it depends how large a design team you have, what activities potentially can you do outside of a sprint that don't necessarily require cross collaboration if you don't have the time, or you need to measure and look at all these things. Yes, there's definitely value by bringing a cross-functional team and putting them in a room. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying you need to look at what you're trying to solve. But as I've been saying throughout, and something we do here at Property Finder, is we could look at some of these things and turn them into a workshop. So ideation and sketching and voting on the best sketch are things you can do with your developers, with your product manager, with marketing people, with whoever the cross-functional team should be. And that could be a workshop of 2 to 3 hours. And you can just do that as an activity. Customer interviews, again, are a great example of you involving other people for them to hear firsthand what customers are saying, not just for you to present a shiny report at the end. Usability testing, other things that you can do and involve other people to observe. Whether you do them in a room and do it all in a day, or you take 2 days or 3 days, again, it depends on the problem you're trying to solve. The value here is that often organizations are siloed and don't speak to each other. And this brings in a cross-functional team in, say, if we're looking at a corporate and you're able to, or even a startup in this example, and you're able to, get alignment and get a proposed solution that has been tested and validated. And the value is you save huge amounts of time, of resources, and potential waste of developing things that people don't want, that aren't tested, or that haven't got buy-in across the business. Anything you wanted to add, Nada, or any other questions?
No, that makes perfect sense.
So again, just to set the scene, the difference here, the first example, the case study, was in person. We had access to the person. We were all together in a boardroom, not too different from the one I'm in now. Here, it's all online. And we had roughly a month of not just doing the sprint, but also building the prototype and testing it and recruiting, because all of those things take time. And this didn't happen over 6 days. This happened over, I think, something like 2 to 3 weeks. And then it took us a little bit more time to do the testing. So that's not building as in developing, but creating something that can be testable and recruiting real customers. And that happened, we had like 1 month US and UK and 1 month Australia and UK, due to the time differences. But there were enough kind of people on both to keep things in check. So the day one was, the first workshop or session online was review the pre-design sprint. So everyone filled out what I showed a second ago. Just review it, set up long-term goals, and vote and align on those. And how would we fail? What could go wrong? Journey map, etc. Again, I'm doing what I did in the last one. I'm going into too much detail. Customer interviews and how might we? Ideation and sketching. So there was homework in between and critiquing of that. I'll go into it in more details in a second. Collaboratively build the initial version of the final prototype as a team, looking at Figma. Low fidelity prototype creation and interview guide, testing, analysis, and kind of validating next steps. So triple diamond, if you will. And, oh, okay, I didn't go into, I thought I would have more detail. But each of these sessions was done using Miro, or formerly known as real-time board, and having a facilitator and decision maker. So in the Australia example, I was the facilitator and one of the co-founders was the decision maker, to just make sure we kept going. But again, there wasn't too much decisions that needed to be made, because we did have a lot of stars, for example, or like if you do pay for Miro, unfortunately, they make you pay for some of their great features. You do have a voting facility, so you can set a clock and you can say, highlight an area of the screen and say, there are 3 votes or 5 votes or whatever, 3 votes, and then it'll automatically tell you what's the top voted thing. And then we had customer interviews that everyone kind of listened to. We honed in on the how might we. We then had the weekend to create 8 ups, or 8 different sketches, and then one great sketch, which we took a photo of if you're doing a sketch with a pencil or color pencils or whatever, and put it online. You vote on it, you critique it, you establish some of the winning ideas and kind of, decide and converge on that thing. We then turn that into, more detail in terms of a prototype. And then it was up to the designer, it was the same guy who worked on both, to turn this into a low fidelity prototype, and at the same time worked an interview guide, and then conduct with real customers over, span of maybe a week, usability tests, and do some synthesis as well. We also trialed at the same time a tool called user testing, and did unmoderated testing in one of the sprints, and put the prototype. And user testing has a lot of kind of demographics where you can pick, people's age, industry, roles, etc. It's a very expensive tool, but because we were doing a trial, we had full functionality, which was great. And we were able to, hone in and understand and validate that, that prototype. But it wasn't always unmoderated testing. We were trialing the tool for one of the examples. Any questions before we get on to lessons?
Yeah, we have a question that says, do you recommend we subscribe to Miro?
I recommend you trial it, just like any other software. There's so many things out there. In that market, the two best ones from my experience are definitely Miro and Mural, M-U-R-A-L. The head of design at Mural is the same guy I mentioned earlier, who wrote the Jobs to be Done book and also a lot of other great books, Jim Kalbach. Both great tools. It really, it's kind of like a question of, I don't know, any design tool versus another. There's always kind of new ones. I think definitely if you're part of an organization that's got a budget, like you can do this thing monthly, and I think seeing all of their features is great. Some of their paid features, but you can definitely use it and get a lot of benefit out of the free version. Any other questions?
Yeah. Is the design sprint always a linear process, or can it be non-linear as well?
Great question. Definitely, yes. Like I've said, and hopefully that's one of your takeaways, is what I'm showing here, day 1 to 6, is very different than what I showed in the first case study, on purpose, to show you that, yes, there is a book, but my main, kind of mantras, if you will, is, and something that, especially if you're new or young or aspiring designer, is don't stick to the book. Change the book, carve it up, experiment. I mean, I think we as designers, including myself, we don't do enough experimentation as much as we should, or often we're constrained, but that's part of the magic and the fun of design, right? It's not just pure science, it's also art, and it's up to you to change things up and do what fits. Can you run things in parallel? Yeah, you can definitely run things in parallel. It really much depends on who you've got, their expertise, and what you think makes sense for the problem you're trying to solve. What's your view on it, Nada? Have you done?
Yeah, no, I think, like you said, nothing should ever be linear. Everything that we do can be nonlinear, and that, especially when it comes to design. So you have a process, you can follow it, but you can mix it up. You have to see what works for you, and you have to see what you're working with. And based on that, you come up with the right process to help you, again, achieve those objectives that you're doing. You're not doing this for nothing. You're doing this for to get to a certain result and objective. So you need to figure out what works for you and get the right process. I think this is really a guide to help you. And then you work with what you have. And on that note, Lauren asks, did you get any feedback from the clients in either case study about how they found the design sprint process? what did they find valuable about it?
Yeah, let me just go back one. So which clients? You mean in this particular example or the previous one?
I think she's asking about both, either
Okay.
one.
I mean, so in the first example, definitely there was a huge amount of value. Like, we built a great partnership with this startup. By them, it was very different than typically how we worked on larger projects, because like I said, they didn't really have an office. The guy was a consultant part-time and doing the startup part-time, and came into the office and worked with us very closely, and got to, you know, form a real bond. They then had their launch, because they had no office, at our office. And we were able to, you know, forge a great relationship with them going forward. Again, it was in person. With this particular one, it's been an ongoing challenge. I think there are many challenges to remote work. Again, that's probably a meetup in and of itself. We've said that a lot tonight. Nada, we should watch this video again, and that could be our backlog for the next 6 months. One of the challenges of remote work that I've found in this particular startup, I haven't done a huge amount of it, was everyone is kind of the CEO, especially in early stage startups. You've got a group of very passionate people who want this thing to succeed. They're in it not just for financial reward. They're in it because they believe in the cause, in making a better world, in the dream, and etc. All those nice cliches. And the challenge with that is that if everybody is the CEO or everyone's got their ideas, it's sometimes hard to have alignment, even if you've got, you know, things like design sprints. We've also, in this example, and I didn't really talk about it tonight, but because it wasn't relevant in the first, because we had a very humble engineer, one of the, probably the humblest engineer I've ever met. But in this example, having a lot more people in a design sprint, you do have a case of the louder person having influence over other people, or talking or dominating too much. And how do you moderate that, especially if it's remote and you're not in a room? A lot harder to do. So I think there were definitely wins, but there were still challenges. I think it's an ongoing challenge of any organization when you don't necessarily have people who are passionate about product or design or lean methodologies to think of a company as a product company. I think that's easier said than done. So how much did we measure it? Probably not as much as we should. It's a great question, but I think a little bit. And yeah, it was mixed results in terms of how valuable it was. And also it hasn't continued, this style of working, because it does take a lot of effort by a lot of people, especially when you have a startup with limited people, with limited time, who are not all full-time across. So that's not how they're working today. I've taken more of a back seat, but I'm still kind of involved as an advisor. And yeah, it was run for a period of time. So yeah, I guess that's a result in and of itself, right? That speaks to itself. Any other questions?
There's conversation going on about which usability testing tool would one recommend. I think if everyone in the chat wants to respond to that, that would be great. Then we'd get a lot of tools out there. But if there's something specific,
yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely a topic I don't think we've done. Like, I've got a 3-hour workshop on lean usability testing, which I never ran for this meetup. It's more of a hands-on thing where you actually get to do it. I've ran it in Perth and in Melbourne a bunch of times, not for meetups, but for, you know, like General Assembly, GA, and the other General Assembly wannabes. I forget their name, Lauren, in Perth. That's how long I've been away. It's crazy. You know what I'm talking about. And I think just on that, the core thing to differentiate, for those of you who haven't done it, is unmoderated versus moderated testing. Unmoderated testing is where we have a program, a machine, doing the questions for you. So you're not there asking the questions. You load your prototype or your design, and then you ask, a question is typed, someone has to read it, they have to answer it, and then they click next, and the next question could be why. But it's not as engaging. You can't deep dive as much as moderated testing. So the tools for moderated is anything you can record with. Could be look back, could be whatever. But for unmoderated, we use userfeel.com is one of the ones we use, because you can purchase credits, but there's many out there. So yeah, we can let the debate go on. Anything you wanted to add to that, Nana, your view?
No, I mean, I think there's so many tools out there. Just you need to figure out what works for you, I guess. And like you mentioned before, so many of the online tools, they always give you like a set of trials, so you can just see what works. But it would be actually great, Jonathan, you know, for you to give us that session you're talking about here in the UAE as well. I think we would like that.
Do an online hands-on workshop.
Yeah.
I also want to do a panel soon, maybe after next month. You and I can chat about that. I mean, it'd be great. We haven't asked lately, actually, Nada, if people in the chat, now's a good opportunity, want to tell us what they'd love to hear. That'd also be good.
Yeah.
Cool.
Definitely.
Any other questions?
One that just came in. As a designer, you have a good idea about what good design is, and sometimes the client has a specific look of the end product designs. How do you keep the balance to do good design and keep up with the client's taste?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I'd recommend you read the book Design is a Job by Mike Montero, and his second book as well. It's a really big question. I think from my perspective, it's very much, again, it depends on who you are. And if we're talking about an agency here, right, in this example, ultimately it's very challenging, because you're not, you can't be always your natural self and give an unbiased view, because ultimately the client is paying and the client has to be happy. Yes, you can, I think my advice would be taking them along on the journey and potentially showing them what great looks like. So again, in this example that I gave, the first case study, where we had to create a brand and an identity, we didn't start from a blank slate. We did our homework based on the industry and based on some input from the client. But then, the client helped us to hone in on the final thing. And when it came to, selecting logos, etc., again, it was a case of you controlling that environment, you controlling the world of what you show, what you don't show. I mean, these things can be tested too. You can do, you can do sessions with potential clients. You can see what resonates. You can do brand, you can do research. I think ultimately research speaks to itself. So it's not opinion versus opinion. When you have research, you're introducing to that client, if they've never done it before, this is what customers say. So again, if you've got usability testing, when the penny drops, like that's why I love usability testing. If you get your client to observe their software or their proposed software or prototype being used by their customer, and the customer saying, this is really painful for me, and many customers saying that, then that will speak volumes to a lot more than you speaking or having opinion or just showing them the final report at the end. I think bringing them and involving them throughout the journey is really key. And it's something that I think agencies don't do enough of. It's kind of like a black box. It's like we have this magic, and they limit how involved clients are. And that's why, this design sprint was great, because we really opened our doors and they got to see everything. There was no full transparency over what we do and how we think and what we think the next step should be, and debating it with the client. You don't often have that luxury. I think it's building rapport is really important. You've been
I just add something to that, Jonathan, because I was
consultant. I think
I was having I was having a conversation with a colleague today about something similar to this. And I think what's really important as designers, when we get into a project that we're working with, whether it's on agency side or whether you're in-house, is really you need to believe in yourself that you are the expert. And I think a lot of the time when I hear designers saying things or asking questions like that is because they take maybe more of a timid approach when they are dealing with their clients or their colleagues in-house, is that you are the design expert and you need to make sure that you bring that to the table so that they will take your opinions and they will take your recommendations seriously. And if you don't think that you're the expert and you're not there yet, then that's okay. It's a learning experience. You're going to get there, but you're working your way to get that expertise. And a lot of the time we need to prove our expertise. Either it's by bringing in what we're talking about, things such as user testing, research, referring to books and referring to other experts out there, but always really holding true to that expertise that you have as a designer, and then proving that that's part of what we need to do and what we need to learn to do as well, that sort of that belief in yourself when you are taking it out there. And then sometimes you'll still have people who are going to come back and say, no, I want the button to look like this, or I want the design to look like this, even after you've tried and you proved it. Then put it in there and maybe bring in another sample of how you think it looks like, and then they can compare the two, and then another way to sort of sell it. So sometimes we do need to have that sort of sales hat on our heads as well, and also just always do have that belief in yourself that you are the expert and that you can really take that back to the table. It's the energy that you also bring to it. I really think that's important. And if you truly care and you push forward with it, you can convince your clients or your colleagues about the design decisions that you think is important or needs to go through.
Agreed, 100%. Great point. Any other questions?
So we are getting some questions to come in. What was the targeted metric achieved after execution for the oil and gas project? I guess the goal was to get 3+ users using the product. Was it measured and reflected upon for design later on?
Yes. The core question was, does the design have product market fit? In other words, does the design, the digital version of the product, reduce the consulting effort required today? We knew there was stage one, there'd still be considerable consulting effort, but this MVP, the first iteration, is their buy-in. And we had enough experts who understand this particular industry, even small numbers, if it's an expert user who is right, is enough to give you that buy-in. And I think the other challenge, just to kind of people to understand, is it's very niche. We're not talking about like a SaaS product that's bought by millions of people. We're talking about like a BP paying hundreds of thousands for a license to maybe use this or customize it or white label it for their needs. So if if you're getting that niche, you can, if you've got 5 customers, or even the customers under that tier, that success, they were able to, they were very successful following launch, and we continue to work with them. So yeah, totally, like the sample's not enough, but yeah, you need to, it really depends on the problem you're solving. And this was a brand new way of solving this problem in the world, in terms of all the research done by both the founders and ourselves, because it is, as I say, it's quite a niche field, and it's not a field that's been disrupted yet. Anything other questions? Hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, I think just there, everyone's keen to see the next lessons learned on this on this side, and I think some people might be having to leave soon, so
okay,
just let's keep.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's get to an end. There's only a couple more slides. So the lessons with this one is focus on the problem we're solving, and the solutions required is crucial. There's no time to let any and all ideas, and it's a facilitator's role to ensure the focus and the how might we of the sprint is maintained. This minimizes waste and confusion. So, again, a lot of people, a lot of ideas, but really important and crucial to hone in and minimize discussion about everything. Sensible defaults, existing standards and toolkits really help in providing guardrails and training as well as onboarding for the team. So think of it as, I haven't seen this before, but I kind of just, I don't know if, I'm sure it exists somewhere, design sprint ops, but all of, what we had was the templates in terms of what do you do and the steps you go through every one of those days. Really helped. You can find these things online already. The pre-sprint activities, discovery, research, testing needs to be appropriately planned and executed. Make sure it's done, it's scheduled, because otherwise, your time frames can go. Not every design job needs to go through a sprint. It's the other learning. There are some things that can happen outside of a sprint, or if you've got enough known knowns based on research, you can just, do what we normally do, which is you've got the research, design, test, and launch. It doesn't have to necessarily get buy-in from everything. You need to make sure that a sprint is right for what you're doing. It's important to continue to measure team engagement and outcomes and iterate on the sprint methodology so that it works and makes sense for your team. That's to Lauren's question earlier. Again, something that we should have done a better job at measuring and learning from. And the final one, it helps to have a dedicated interaction designer. At the time, they have one today, but at the time they didn't have one that's 100%, dedicated, or has necessarily 100%, but enough time. Having, limited design resource is challenging, because when you're getting people across from multidisciplinary teams or different skills to try to do interaction design, it sometimes creates waste, and it's not as effective as an interaction designer who can look at something, look at maybe 3 ways of doing it, or 5 ways, narrow it down to 2, maybe do A/B testing, or say, look, we've got enough feedback, or whatever. Any other questions? So should I just keep going to the final conclusion, which is I think my last slide, and then we can go to questions and people.
Yep. Keep going. Yep.
So how to get started. There's a lot of great links, a ton of really cool templates out there. This is something, it's not so new, but it's newish, maybe a year it's been around. Maybe we can, I'll share this as well after, or, you can take a screenshot, we can put it in the chat, whatever. The design sprint, this is from Google Toolkit. There's also Google Ventures have another link, which I think I shared earlier around other templates. AJ&Smart, which I've mentioned on LinkedIn, and earlier they've got a lot of great videos you can watch. You can do a masterclass with them. Costs a fair bit of money, but if you want to be an expert and you're in an organization maybe that can pay it, or you have a lot of money, then go for it, recommended. The sprint book is really great. There's an audio version of the sprint book. There's the physical book, which you can get, and it's very practical, talks about in detail, the 5 days in the sprint book example. In terms of design sprint ops, those are other things that can help you, how to operationalize design sprints. In the Isobar agency that I worked for, we had like a really sophisticated, came out of Melbourne, depending on the client and their problem and their budget, we can do this in 3 days, 5 days, or 10 days. And also what a research sprint could look like, a pre-sprint research sprint. And what do you do in 3 days, 5 days, and 10 days? You can form your own sensible default for your organization and start to create that and roll out tools, resources, templates, how-to guides. And my final message, like I've been saying, is don't get carried away. This is just another tool in your tool bag. Not everything is a design sprint. You get people super passionate about these things and they try to jam a design sprint into every design challenge. You need to make sure that it's the right thing, you use it at the right time and the right use case. Any questions? The other thing is, as Nada said, feel free, add me on LinkedIn if you haven't already. Reach out on LinkedIn to Nada and myself, add Nada. Huge thank you as well to Nada And Assad as well, who's on the call, who's helped us with marketing and collateral for the meetup. We're always happy to answer any other questions on LinkedIn, or happy to answer them now. If you have to go, thanks for coming. And yeah, over to you, Nada, with any other questions.
No more questions. I think I just asked a question in the chat for different topics and ideas. So I think that's been coming through. So we'll just maybe save that chat so that we don't lose any of what everyone was saying
we'll
in the
save
chat and the
we can
ideas.
provide
Yeah.
it to everyone like we've done before.
Yeah. And
cool.
Yeah. No other questions out there? Anyone else? I hope I didn't miss anyone's question as well. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That was really great, very interesting. I think something that we all do in one way or another when it comes to design sprints. So it's really great to see the examples of how you've done it for two different types of businesses and or companies, especially the fact that you showed us one that was completely online with the way we're all working right now. That was really promising to see that you can actually conduct that in an online environment as well. So that was really great. And yeah, thanks everyone for their participation, questions, and we will have this available on YouTube, right? So that you can refer to it or share it with your colleagues. And yeah, until next time.
Awesome. Did you have any other questions, Nada, or any comments or thoughts you wanted to make?
No, I think that's pretty much, we've discussed everything. I think that's pretty good. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, Nada. Thanks everyone for coming. It was really great. I enjoyed it. Hope you did too.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome.
And you're getting a lot of thank yous and really valuable sessions.
Kudos to Lauren. It is 9 o'clock in Dubai and 1 a.m. in Perth. So thanks for staying till the end.
Yeah, she says worth staying up till 1 a.m. for. So good night, Lauren.
Good night. Yeah.
Enjoy your evening, everyone else. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We'll share, as Nada said, both the video as well as the chat and whatever, any other links. Cool. Thank you, Nada. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.